Hello and welcome to Amagi, co-hosted by myself, Dylan Moore of the Volitional Science Network, which you can find on YouTube, and Nima Majur of economicsjunkie.com. We are here to tackle ideas, both ancient and modern, in an effort to bring you the tools needed to expand the power of your worldview, making you a more potent entity, professionally, politically, philosophically, or otherwise. We are graciously being hosted by the Think Liberty Network, which you can find at think-liberty.com. This is episode 7. Mortgages are bullshit. Hey, Nima, how you doing?
Pretty good. How are you?
Well, I was thinking that we should sit down and do a recording like we normally do on money. What do you think of that? And
I like it.
Going along with what we had talked about last week, which most of our podcasts up until this point have been about modern money theory and what that means in a very macroeconomic sense. And Nima took the time last week to talk about the permanent portfolio, which was, well, let's look at MMT, or I guess just finance in general. MMT definitely helps understand it. Let's look at what you can do individually as someone who understands MMT and what this means for your own personal savings, which I thought was very fascinating. Like I said in the last podcast, it was news to me. So I think it's some really powerful information, what you can do with your own resources once you understand this stuff. And for this week, we wanted to talk about something that's a little closer to what I'm familiar with, and which is, I guess I'll start with real estate. Not that I'm a guru yet, but I've got some experience under my belt that I think is worth going over. And before we talk about that, I actually wanted to tell 2 short stories, if you don't mind, Nima.
Go for it.
That had to do with kind of my introduction as an adult to money. So when I was 17, I got my first car payment. My family had helped me with the down payment to get a Oldsmobile Alero, a white Oldsmobile Alero, year 2000, ugly motherfucking car. I still, to this day, I still get pissed off when I see those things drive by. And I ended up with like this $150 a month payment. And it was like the worst thing that ever happened in my life. I was like, who thought of this shit? Like, you're saying if I don't come up with $150 every month, that they're going to take my car away? I'm like, why didn't I just save up money and buy the car and be done? Or find a cheaper car or whatever, right? And I also remember trying to figure out the interest, because I had some interest rate. I don't remember if it was 8% or 9% or something. And I'd get the bill, and the bill would be like $50 interest and $100 principal. And I'm like, how the fuck is this 9%? That's 33%. What's going on with this math? And I was learning about interest rates in my math class in school, and I couldn't figure out what the hell this car bill said. So I paid this stupid thing off. It was a 4-year loan. And I remember when I was 21, so 4 years later, I got a tax return, because I had gotten a job at an oil refinery and I was getting paid semi-decently for someone that age. And I got a tax return. It was like $700. That was enough to pay off the rest of my loan, which was $700. So I, waltzed into the bank and I slammed that check down, and I'm like, I'm done. I am never making a payment on this car again. It's mine. I'm over. Yes. And I walked home and I told my mom what I did. I'm like, Mom, I paid the car off. And she's like, oh my God, that's great. Are you going to buy a new car? And I'm like, no, it's paid off. Why would I do that? I'm done. And the kind of middle-class mindset had never hit me up until then, or at least the American middle class mindset, which is this idea that whatever your income level is you load your debt load like just underneath where there's barely enough breathing room. And if you ever pay something off, well, that's simply room to take on some more debt. And maybe no one ever sat me down and explained it to me why that was good. But when my mom said that, I was just horrified. I'm like, who created this? Why are we all living like this? What? And to compound that, this is the second story. So I mentioned I was working at this oil refinery. This is approximately at the same time. I went to work one day and everybody's in there. And technically, I'm just an intern. I'm getting paid less to do the same thing everybody else is doing in this laboratory. And we would have this morning meeting, and one of my coworkers came in that morning, and she was talking about this 30-year mortgage that she just signed on to buy this house. And for some reason, at 21, a 30-year mortgage was news to me. I didn't know that such things existed. And thinking about my car, that I had just gone through like these 4 agonizing years of $150 a month, where I was pulling my hair out over that. I couldn't even contemplate 30 years. I'm like, you're going to be paying that for 30 years. That's like double forever. And I looked at her and I'm like, why would you do that? And I remember her, she had this very cool attitude. Her legs were crossed and she was stirring her coffee with the nasty creamer that they kept in the break room. And she's like, well, that's just what you're going to have to do if you want to buy a house. And that was roughly the time where I'm like, you know what? I think it's time for me to quit and go become a vagabond in Europe. I'm out of here. I'm not playing this game. You know, if I have to get this job, in which I hated this job at the oil refinery, if I have to get this job, and I had a guaranteed job upon graduation, which would have paid me about $60,000 a year, and this was back in 2009. So, I mean, that's respectable, but it's not like you're rich. And I'm thinking, okay, I can get $60,000 a year, which is just enough for me to buy a house that's not that great in an area that I don't really like. So I'm close to the job that I hate. So I can buy a car I can make payments on, like this stupid Alero that I just talked about. So I could drive in between the job that I hate, then the house that I don't like very much, and probably marry somebody who's not that interesting because I'm not that interesting because I live in this sort of situation. I need to rethink this. This is a horrible idea. So this is kind of the fast forward version of it, but I ended up essentially becoming a vagabond and traveling around for 4 years, where I committed myself to figuring out how I can live and survive without needing any money. And I made it a good 4 years. 2.5 of those years were spent in Europe. And funny enough, one day I woke up and I had really put a lot of energy on my back, I should say, where I was volunteering, for example, at a lot of farms in exchange for something to eat and a place to stay. And I got by just by busting ass for people, so they would let me stay at their house. And I'd hitchhike around, and I was always very, very dependent on other people being able to take me in, even though I was willing to exchange something. I was still dependent on them. And I remember I was like 26 or 27. I woke up one morning and I'm like, okay, this has been fun and it's been a great experience, but if I keep doing this, I'm going to turn into one of those old hippies that are like 50 years old, still bouncing around. So I got to change something. And at this point, I'm like, then what? I already tried the other thing. I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to go like live in an oil refinery again and come home reeking of diesel and toluene every day. So what do I do? And so I know a lot of you hear people who have this story a lot. I stumbled into the book Rich Dad Poor Dad, which really opened my mind about how to start thinking about money. Because when I thought of the way I had always been taught to think about money, obviously, is what you get from your parents. And my parents, for example, my mother, taught me to just, increase your debt load until you can barely breathe and slave away at a job that you hate for your entire life to pay for it. And the ideas that Richard Kiyosaki wrote this book. The ideas that Richard Kiyosaki laid out in this book were, for me, pretty mind-blowing. This idea that you kind of have money work for you, which, we'll talk about some examples in a second. And he talks about all sorts of different stuff in the book. And one of the things he talked about in the book was real estate. And I really got fixated on real estate, particularly from the ideas of passive income that you can make from rentals and massive income that you can make from things like flips. So I landed back in Washington State. My clothes were pretty much in tatters because I've been wearing the same shit the whole 4 years. And I didn't have a job. I didn't have a car. I didn't have a place to live. I was bouncing around from friends' houses and stuff. And I'm like, I'm going to do real estate. I guess you have to have ambitions if you're ever gonna do anything. And I'm happy to say, as of now, I currently have 2 real estate flips ongoing. One I'm just tying up the end of, and another one I just started. And I just got a condo under contract, which I'm hoping to wholesale. I may have to flip it myself. I'll explain what some of these words mean. I'm actually doing some of the stuff that I read about. And again, this was 4 years ago. It's taken me a while since then to get up to this speed. But different ways of thinking about money has allowed me to escape the grind that we're taught. And but before I get into any examples of, because I want to analyze specifically this real estate deal that I just put together, because it's an interesting way of looking at money. Nima, you're from Germany.
Yeah.
The dude grew up in West Berlin before the fall of the wall, by the way. I don't know anybody listening knew that. It's pretty cool.
Born and raised.
Does the story I'm telling about how I learned to think about money sound similar to you?
Well,
growing up in Germany?
Growing up in Germany, we didn't really have much consumer debt or even mortgage debt. Most people were renters, and there was really no credit cards. Nobody was using any credit cards other than maybe debit cards with 100% backing. But my first exposure to
which is essentially cash.
Yeah. To that mentality, I think probably came when I came over here and I noticed how people were maxing out credit cards. And it was also, when I came here, it was the early 2000s, which was a period of massive credit expansion post, as we discussed before, the Clinton budget surplus, which drained the private sector, and also a budget current account deficit that was growing, draining the private sector, making it go into more and more debt. And, that sort of went hand in hand with what you could see during those years where, you had every other commercial was about refinancing or getting a consumer loan. And so that was sort of, I guess that mentality was a little new to me. It seems to be arriving in Germany now as well. But at the time when I was growing up there, it was a little different. And also, I think maybe that might have to do with, Germany being generally a saver nation and a net exporter, and the U.S. being a net importer. And during those years that we just discussed, the US was just heavily going into debt. The sort of the last leg of credit expansion prior to 2008. And so, especially for our generation growing up, I think, you especially growing up in the US, you probably just were so immersed and you grew up with it being the status quo, sort of the norm, right?
Yeah. Well, and then, like I said, with seeing my mom talk about the way that she did about the debt, like, oh yeah, you're just gonna buy a new car?
Yeah.
I don't know where I picked up my revulsion to the norm, as you put it, where it's like, well, we'll just load ourselves up to the gills with debt and then see if we can breathe.
Right.
But I don't know why I was like, this is fucking stupid. What is everybody doing?
Yeah, same here. I was never a friend of debt, so I don't understand either how people can so easily give away their freedom, essentially, just to consume some shiny widgets in the present. Instead of
I got my boat, but then my truck isn't big enough to pull the boat, so I bought a new truck, and so I refinanced my house to afford these things, and now my payments are so big I got to work overtime in order to pay for it. Like,
right.
So you're a slave to your. I mean, I guess I sound like Tyler Durden from Fight Club. It's like, so you're a slave to your own stuff.
Right.
So I want to unpack the real estate deal that I just put together. It's literally across the street from me, which is also really cool. I can lean out my window and see how work is coming along on it. But I'm still I got to brag a little bit. I'm patting myself on the back for the way I set this up. So as someone who was born and raised to say, okay, if you want to buy something, you either have to work and earn the money and buy it, or if we listen to my parents, you can finance it and then slave to pay off your payments for this financing. Either way, you're putting in a linear amount of time to get a linear amount of money back, right? You put in hours, and each hour pays a certain amount of money, and the only way that you can make more money is either to work more hours or somehow get that per hour number up. When I did over here, so I came home one day, and I saw this massive pile of crap out in the front yard of my neighbor. And I approached them because I was curious as to what was going on, and I discovered a landlord who was just moaning and groaning about how awful his renter was, and that he's evicting him right now, and they're cleaning up all this crap, and how he was so stupid to ever get involved being a landlord, and he's never doing this again. And I'm like, oh man, can I buy your house? He kind of looked at me like, what? People always tell me I look younger than I am, so I must have been what he thought was this kid coming up. I'm like, hey, I'll buy it. Particularly in the I'm not exactly in the Seattle market, but I'm close enough to it that all the prices are just crazy inflated right now. And I managed to negotiate a lease option with him with rights to repair the property. So what this means is typically what people do when they flip a house is they buy the house at a discount. They put the money into it to fix it up, and then they sell it and they make their profit. The issue with that, particularly in this area, is that the price I agreed to buy it from this guy was $203,000, and the repairs and I have to pay him rent payments. Again, I'll explain that too. Is $1,000 a month, and there's some other things to pay for, which are going to be about $80,000 by the time we fix the house. So the repairs, roughly speaking, are going to be about $80,000, and the acquisition was $203,000. So the acquisition is like 2/3 of the money that you got to come up with in order to flip this house. So what I was able to negotiate with him is to say, okay, I'm going to become your next renter, and you're going to give me exclusive rights to purchase the property for the next year. So we signed a document. It's called an option that says you can't sell this to anybody else for the next year. And at any time within this year, I can exercise the right to purchase the property. and we've already agreed to the price, which is $203,000. So essentially what I've done is I've negated the need to come up with the money up front to acquire the house. And he's agreed to get paid when I sell it. So I'm going to fix it up, get it in tip-top shape, find a buyer, sell it to that buyer, and at closing, which is when all the documents get signed and all the money moves around, the current owner will get paid out of the closing when I sell it. So what this has done, it has allowed me to get into a deal that otherwise would have cost $280,000 to complete. Now it only costs $80,000 to complete. So, because I bump into people now and then who want to, they're like, oh yeah, I'd always be interested in doing real estate or flipping a house, but you have to have some money to get started. And I'm going to sound like Robert Kiyosaki when I say this, but it's like, doesn't have to be your money. Because essentially what this owner has done is he has financed this flip for me, at least the acquisition for the flip. Now, for the other $80,000, I'm also a part of a group for real estate investors. That's where I learned all this stuff. I definitely didn't learn it in school. That's for damn sure. What this allowed me to do, because I only need $80,000 instead of $280,000 to get the deal done, is now when I approach somebody for money, because I don't want to put any of my money in there, I could say, look, our profit is going to be X, and we're hoping it's going to be somewhere between $30,000 and $40,000 by the time we're done. So your profit, we're looking at $15,000 to $20,000 that I'm going to split with you for your money. $15,000 to $20,000 on $280,000 is a pretty so-so rate of return. Particularly if the thing takes 6 months, it's about a 10% rate of return, which is actually annually, I think that's 20. But still, let's just say it was 10%. 10% is not that great. I mean, it's pretty good compared to like treasury bonds or the interest you're getting in your savings account. But if I can come up to them and say, hey, I can get you 20 grand on your 80 grand in 6 months. Now that's a 50% return. That's fucking wild in terms of rate of return on your money. So the way I had this set up, people would be tripping over themselves in order to finance my deal. And so I was able to find a business partner very quickly who had the money to do this. And we formed a JV, a joint venture between him and his corporation and my corporation. We both have corporations set up because you never want to do any of this in your own name, real estate. And we put we got some bids for a contractor, got everything bid out, got all our numbers put together. And right now the whole thing is going. And the only input that I really do is I just walk over every other day or so, because it's, like I said, it's right next to my house, and I check on how the guys are doing and maybe buy them coffee. And the cool thing about this, in terms of money, is that there's always money out there. This is what's so bizarre about this. When we look at this from the individual level, zooming down from the macroeconomic level that we're typically talking about, is that if you're creative enough and you can offer value to somebody, there's always money available to get something done. And the limit suddenly becomes your imagination. Compared to the limit that I was taught when I was growing up, which is literally your time. You go to school, you get good grades to be able to attract the highest per hour rate. $30 an hour, $40 an hour, $80 an hour, $120 an hour that you can. And then you grind your butt at those hours to get the money back. Well, I've flipped this around where now everybody else is working and I'm just sitting there staring at it, and I didn't put a dime I mean, maybe I spent some gas driving around to talk to people, but I didn't put a dime into getting this deal started. And it emphasizes a interesting aspect of mindset because, you know, we've talked a little bit about in this podcast when we're talking about MMT that Nima and I are kind of unique in the landscape because we're, I guess, in the normie sense of the term, on the right when it comes to politics. And I think a lot of people on the left, once they learn MMT, they say, aha, this is the perfect reason why everyone must convert to leftism, because now it makes sense that everything can be afforded, and we can pay for everything that we need to. However, actually, let me finish that thought. Because there's always these underclasses, according to the left. There's always these underclasses that are downtrodden by the upper classes, and that the upper classes are hoarding all the wealth and the resources, and more of it needs to go to the underclasses. And by MMT having particularly the federal job guarantee, we can start raising up the lower classes while simultaneously keeping the taxes on the rich people to push them down a little bit. When you look at money in terms of something that you have to earn by hour off the sweat of your brow and the pain in your back, that idea does make a lot of sense. However, when you understand money is simply a tool that's available if you understand how it works and how to go get it, that idea almost is, it's like it becomes silly to you, because you're like, well, if you could just learn how to use this correctly, you wouldn't need the government to come in and give you all these helping hands and take care of everything for you. Now, I'm not sliding entirely one way or the other on this. However, I want to emphasize that we have a lot more power with money than we're taught. And we've talked about currency a lot on this show so far. We've even talked about potential private currencies, but typically we talk about government currency. I'm gonna introduce a new idea of currency. Also, Nima, you've been pretty quiet. Jump in at any point if you want to say something.
Just listening in so far.
So,
I just wanted to say something real quick.
Yeah,
that's also what MMT is really about. It's just about educating us about the power that we actually have. And in the face of this apparent powerlessness towards fixing unemployment, etc., those are really just lies that were told by the establishment. Those are boundaries that are made up by the establishment to keep us down. Austerity is just a bunch of boundaries that are created by the government to keep us down, but on false pretenses and using bogus reasoning, because people aren't told how the system actually works. Similar to what you're saying, we individually have more power financially than we're being told. Yeah, we're not being told because the rich and powerful want to keep the common folk down.
And of course, when you say rich, we're talking the mega rich.
Yeah.
Right, we're not talking, the millionaire who lives on the nice house up the street. We're talking the mega rich.
The big foundations, the big tax-exempt foundations, etc. The corporate media, the people who rule the world.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because we live in a society where there's this and when I say society, I particularly mean the United States. There's these two phases happening at the same time. I know Dan Carlin of the Hardcore History podcast likes to say that we're a country that's got schizophrenia. On one hand, it's all about freedom this, freedom that, freedom this, freedom that. What's that? Oh, amnesia too, right? Freedom this, freedom that, freedom this, freedom that. But on the other hand, there's like this wildly swinging sword that we're just flailing around. And there's clearly two classes being separated here, where you have these people that are busting ass by the sweat of the brow and the pain of the back versus, people being able to fly around in their own private jets. And what's strange is that in the past, in the historical past, these classes were actually separated by law. Like in India, you have the caste system where it doesn't matter how smart you are, it doesn't matter how connected you are. Your caste is your caste, and that's it. Done. We live in a society where everyone's free and everyone has the same opportunity. Even if we've kind of had this schizophrenia of like, well, clearly the same opportunity is not resulting in everybody doing well. Even if it's not equally well, everybody's not necessarily doing well. So obviously that there's something separating the two. And I'm going to say right here, there actually isn't. The rules are the same for everybody. I mean, unless you're like a Clinton or something, and these make it ultra rich in the tax exempt foundations. Anywhere below that, we all have the same rules apply to us. The difference is we're never taught the rules. One of them is taxes, and if we have enough time, we can talk about taxes near the end of this. But one of the rules is looking at what I'm going to call the four currencies here, and this is something I learned in the groups I've learned about the real estate from. And I think it's a very interesting way to change your mindset, which is there's what I'm going to call the employee mindset and the entrepreneur mindset. And these and they have different ways of looking at these four currencies, which are time, money, knowledge, and relationships. Now, for the employee, the most important of these four currencies is money. An employee mindseted person will trade time for money 40 years out of their life in hopes to get enough money that they can relax their time later in life. For a lot of people, that hasn't worked out, and they're still working. They're still willing to trade time for money. The entrepreneur sees money as a tool. They want their time, and they say, okay, how do I use the money to get my time back so I can do what I want? So the employee, they see time as the tool and money as the goal. And then they see knowledge as a burden, because one of the things that we learned in school, or I don't know if learn is the right word, we were conditioned in school, is to see learning as something, as a necessary evil to get to the next step. Like, you need to learn this because it's going to be on the test, and it doesn't matter if it's painful. And for a lot of us who get through the school system, this didn't happen to me, but I remember seeing this attitude even when I was in school, is that learning sucks, it's painful, and it's only relevant for the authority figure telling you to do it and you making that authority figure happy. That's the only reason that you need to learn more. And once you've learned a certain amount of knowledge, that's the knowledge you need to do the thing that you do, and you're good. And the way that the employee thinks about relationships is competitive, contrary to what your local Marxist might teach you. If there's multiple employees working in a company and a management position or a higher position comes up, suddenly everybody's at each other's throats because everybody wants that position, and there's a fight for it because there's only one of them available. So at the end of the day, this actually keeps everybody separated from each other and not working well with each other. Honestly, to be an employee is actually kind of to be like a child. And I think the state actually looks at you this way as well, where everything needs to be taken care of for you because you're not really capable of making your own decisions and you're not really capable of getting along with anybody else. The entrepreneur now sees time as the goal and money is simply the tool. Knowledge is seen as an opportunity and relationships are seen as cooperative, right? If we go back to my real estate deal that I just described, my relationship with the owner and my relationship with my business partner who provided the funding was crucial to get this done because I didn't have the $80,000 to put the deal together. So and again, this is going to be contrary to what your local Marxist has taught you, which is that, capitalism and entrepreneurialism is all about competition. Everybody has to compete and everyone's at each other's throats to get the most money and to exploit the most. When in reality, there's a little bit of that going on. Like if me and Nima are in the same business on the same block in the same town, yeah, we're going to try, we're going to be competing with each other a little bit, but everything else is cooperative. We got to cooperate with the person who's fixing our building or bringing us our inventory or helping train our employees or whatever. And the mindset isn't enough, but this mindset is required to actually get yourself in a position where you could say, okay, I don't want to be a member of the downtrodden classes anymore. I need to think differently. And it's no one's going to do it for you. There's this idea that like rich people just sit around and smoke cigars and check their stock tickers all day and drink whiskey. When in reality, these people got there because they worked their fucking asses off. And they work and work and work and work. I mean, yeah, maybe every once in a while you end up with a trust fund baby who's the son or the daughter of one of these people, and they blow it in a generation, which is a common occurrence. And then the generation under that gets to start over. But this is what really separates the two. This line between employee and entrepreneur. And the entrepreneur really sees the knowledge as the requirement to move forward. Every entrepreneur or business owner that I've ever met is constantly learning, constantly reading books, and constantly looking for relationships. I mean, everyone's heard it's not what you know, it's who you know. It's totally goddamn true. Again, I've spent a lot of time busting my back working on other people's houses. For example, doing demo, cleaning stuff up. I've done painting, I've done landscaping and all that other stuff. And this is the first time with this place across the street that I just get to sit back and watch everybody else do it. It's amazing. And I compare that. Sorry, I keep talking about this damn car that I had. My mom's attitude toward the car of just... Or my coworker's attitude toward, you got to get a mortgage and then just sit on it, and 30 years later, after your soul is rotted with the house, you'll finally own this house, and maybe you could sell it at a profit and retire in a vaguely better position than you were 30 years ago. Woo-wee, how do I get on that timeline? So what I'd want to do, I feel like I'm rambling here a little bit, Nima. Do you got anything to jump in before I switch?
No,
switch gears.
Switch away.
So I wanted to get a little bit more practical in this. And a couple things I wanted to talk about here were credit and finance. We've talked a little bit about like the credit origins of money. I mean, we talked about the statist origins of money, but it's probably due to the fact that there was a credit origin of money. And so I've got the story, Nima, of the origin of money. You ready for it? I've got the actual factual story of how money was and credit were originally created. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
It involves two cavemen. So there's a young caveman and an old caveman in 20 million BC. Oh, were we men? Well, 1 million BC. Let's go with 1 million BC. And the old caveman, he's pretty old and he's got a lot of experience, and he's got a lot of sticks in his cave that he's collected over his life that he's hunted with. And the young caveman, he doesn't have a stick. He needs to go hunting. And so he goes to the old caveman and he's like, look, man, can I borrow a stick? Because I need to go hunting. And the old caveman's like, look, man, these sticks took me a lot of time and a lot of work to find and to make properly. I'm not just going to, give you my stick. What are you going to give for me if I give you one of my sticks? And he's like, well, I'll give you some of the meat that I get back from what I catch. And they agree to how much meat exactly that is. And the old caveman lends the young caveman a stick, and he comes back and he goes out and he kills the animal, and he brings back the meat to the old caveman and gives him the stick back. What does that young caveman now have? He's got good credit. Because if he needs a stick again, if he goes back and he asks that old caveman, like, oh, can I use a stick to go hunting again? More than likely, the old caveman's going to be like, yeah, you brought me back meat last time. I didn't have to do a damn thing. Here you go. Now, if we look at that same story, and let's say the same caveman, he goes hunting, he sees a deer, he throws a stick, and he goes, foo, over a cliff, and he comes back to the old caveman, and the old caveman's like, whoa, where's the meat? And the guy's like, man, I lost your stick. Does the old caveman care why he lost the stick?
No.
And now that young caveman's going to have bad credit regardless of the reason that the stick was lost. So, I mean, the story is a joke, but the principle is that credit fundamentally is just a relationship between people. It's a measure. I mean, and it's hard to give units to it. It's a measure of trustworthiness that we have with each other. And, this applies both to, for example, the real estate deal that I just described, and the person that I got the money from, he trusts me, and so I have good credit with this guy. But it also refers to the credit system. And I want to give a disclaimer here. Nima gave this one last time. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not a credit advisor. I'm not a tax advisor. All this stuff I'm learning, I've learned from classes I've taken. And even the story I'm repeating, this is the one that the credit teacher likes to repeat in class. Don't take anything that I'm saying to the bank from this conversation, but do take it as a reason to research further. Or send us a message, and maybe we could have future stuff to chat about. But going back to credit cards, as Nima was saying, most of us have been taught to use credit in a way where we buy crap, which is a fancy word for toys, boats, RVs, cars, houses, TVs, whatever, anything else that we could finance, so we can go to work to pay it off. Whereas if we were able to take credit and make more money with it, for example, let's say I was able to go to a bank and utilize money from the bank to do this real estate deal across the street from me. That's using credit to make you more money. Now, I had always considered things like credit cards to be evil and mortgages to be evil. Like after this thing with my mom, the thing with a coworker, I'm like, okay, all debt's evil. I want nothing to do with it. Get it away from me. But now that I understand it, I'm like, shit, if I had a big line of credit at a bank, and a line of credit is kind of like, it's a revolving account, kind of like a credit card where you can just pull cash in or pull cash out and put cash in without any approval from the bank other than the initial approval of giving it to you in the first place. Is completely different from a mortgage. If I had a large enough line of credit, I wouldn't have to ask anybody to do any of these real estate deals. I wouldn't have to rely on somebody else to bring the money to me. And so understanding the credit system was a huge thing to me, because I never realized, Nima, tell me if you ever realized this, not only are your finances kept track of, the main three credit bureaus, which are Experian, Equifax, and TransUnion, they keep track of like goddamn everything about you. Now, someone like a bank isn't allowed to check on your race or the neighborhood that you live in, or all these other things, because it's defined by law that they're not allowed to use that to influence their credit decisions. But I kind of had Big Brother chills when I learned about how much is being kept track of with you in your credit. I don't want to say score, because it's a little different, but your credit report is pretty eerie. But I then learned that you could use this as an opportunity. So I'm sure everybody's been turned down for credit, right? And there's this idea that your credit score is kind of a thing that exists. Sorry, I'm laughing, and I'm sure nobody knows why. So one of the cool things that I've learned is that there's kind of ways to cheat your credit score, and when you learn the rules of the credit system, you learn why you've always been shooting yourself in the foot, and how you can kind of reach into it backwards to improve your score. So what your credit score is, there's actually a technical definition for your credit score, which is, I think I'm remembering this correctly, it's a numerical representation of the likelihood that you'll be 90 days late on any given payment at any given time. Did you know that, Nima?
I did not know that specific definition, no.
Yeah, so when you get your credit scores, it's specifically that. And what's also interesting is that there are, like, I don't know if hundreds is the right word or right amount, but there's at least dozens of different methods of generating your credit score. This is why, like, if you go to Credit Karma or something, it'll generate some scores, but then you go to the bank and they tell you like a completely different number. People have probably heard of, like, there's FICO and there's Vantage and there's Beacon, which these are actually different formulas that a credit institution or a bank or whatever who's analyzing your credit is going to take your raw information, which is your actual payment histories and your actual accounts that are open and things like that, and say, okay, revolving accounts are worth this much, payment history is worth this much, and utilization ratio is worth this much. And so this one's worth 30% of your score, this one's worth 35% of your score, this one's worth 5% of your score, inquiries are worth this much, and we're going to generate a score from 350 to 999 or 0 to 800 or whatever. And this is why your credit score could be all over the place. And which is also why you can never really base your credit availability simply off of your score. Score is kind of like a barometer. It gives you a rough idea of kind of where you're at, but what a financial institution is mostly interested in is the actual things on your credit report. So sometimes they'll say, okay, you might need a minimum score of this or this, but they're actually more interested in what's your payment history? How do you handle with multiple revolving lines? How do you handle with multiple installment payments? And most importantly, they're going to want to know what your debt to income ratio is to see if you could take on the additional debt. So that probably sounds pretty normal to everybody. But what is very interesting is once you understand the rules, and I'm not going to be able to go over all the rules here, you realize that the credit system isn't necessarily there to work against you. That credit system is a record for other institutions to see how well you've been doing. And if you can go back and say, okay, I'm going to do really well so I can show everybody that I'm doing so well, when you actually go and apply for credit, you will do really well. And I'll give at least one hint here that actually I do want to mention a few things, which is, and again, not a credit advisor. I'm learning this from classes I've took from a specific teacher who owns a credit repair thing. I'm not going to drop names here, but his three resources are, if I remember these correctly, congressional testimony, law, and any official statement that comes out of the credit bureaus themselves about how they're handling analysis of credit. So the last thing you want to do is go on some internet forum, and this even applies to me. This is why I'm saying go find a professional and learn from them. The last thing you want to do is go on an internet forum and listen to what people are telling you about credit, because everybody's making up wild shit all over the place, and it can be very difficult to tell what's real and what's not. So a quick overview is that, like I said, your credit score is actually made up of multiple chunks. Some of these chunks, and you'll see this if you go on like Credit Karma or something. Some of these chunks are like how many inquiries you've had, what your payment history is, how many revolving accounts you've had, what are the age of your revolving accounts, and so on and so forth. And the rules that they draw out, for example, are if you have a revolving account, and a revolving account is a credit card or a line of credit, and it's called revolving because you can take money out and put money back in. If you have 0 to 30% utilization, that's considered good. 30 to 50% utilization is considered not that great, and 50% and up is considered bad. So, for example, if you had a $1,000 credit card, if you're using 0 to $300, you're in the green. 301 to 500, you're in the yellow. 501 and up, you're in the red. And your credit score is going to reflect that. And a lot of times, I've heard this from some different credit agencies. If you've got over a 50% utilization ratio, they won't even look at you sideways. So one of the interesting things that you can do is if you look at if you go online and you look at your credit card statements, there'll actually be a place there that says where you when you make your payment, and when it says like recording date or report date or something like that. That's the date once a month that the card will actually report to the bureaus of whatever your utilization ratio is at that moment. So whatever you do during the month, as long as you can make sure that the utilization ratio is at wherever you want it to be when that report date happens, that's the date that's going to go and get reported. Because age is so important, and because the utilization ratio is so important, also debt limit is important. They want to see it's considered healthy that you have some debt to work with, or you have a debt limit to work with, because if you ask an institution for a $50,000 credit card and they see that you've never had one before, essentially they're going to think, well, we don't know how you can handle with a high debt limit. So one of the things that I did, this is the cheat, is people say, well, how do you get credit established in the first place? What I did is I found a friend who had a very old credit card, and you want to get at least 5 years old. He had an 18-year-old credit card, and you want to find one that's got, if I remember correctly, it's like at least a $10,000 limit. His was like $18,000 or $20,000. And the perfect spot, again, you want to be in between 0 and 30. It can't be 0 because that just says you don't use it, which means an institution isn't going to know how you're going to handle when you actually use it. 10% is kind of the really sweet spot. And my friend hit all of these categories. It was 18 years old, like a $20,000 limit, and he was using like exactly 10% of it. I asked him if he could make me an authorized user on his credit card. And what that means is essentially the credit agency sends a card to me and I am able to use the card. And he is responsible for everything that happens on that card. So I would be able to swipe everything. And then if I didn't pay it, they come back and they want him. And I said, don't actually give me the card. You just keep it and shred it or keep it away from me. But by having my name on the card, when it reports, my name is going to get reported and inherit the entire credit history of that card. And when I checked my credit the next month, my score went from 650 to 730 and within the span of a month or some crazy shit like that. Because suddenly my oldest age of account was 18 years. My limit was, $20,000 plus a small amount that I already had. And my average age of accounts, which is another one that they like to look at, grew immensely as well. And suddenly I was able to apply for credit where they're like, oh, we want to see at least 5 years of payment history. We want to see this. We want to see that. We want to see this and we want to see that. I didn't have any of it, but I just took it from my friend and I was able to, access credit history through there. And I ended up getting what was my limit? I ended up with a $23,500 credit card from that when I started with nothing. Pretty cool when a lot of people are doing the thing where, you get a secured credit card and use it for a little while to start kind of building up some credit history. I said you could use other people's money. Well, you could also use other people's credit where you can, literally just inherit their credit history. So I'm spending a lot of time on credit. Nima, did you have anything to say before I keep going on? You're remarkably quiet. I don't know if I'm boring or I'm worth listening to or I'm keeping you excited.
Yeah, so when I came to this country, I had to fast forward through that process a little bit because I came here when I was 21 or 22 and actually maybe started working at 23, I think, out here at least. And I did what you just said. I got a secured credit card at first, and then after a year, they were willing to extend my line, and then over time, were willing to extend it more and more. So that way, I was able to build up credit organically. Mm-hmm. But I didn't have a friend.
And there's nothing wrong.
Yeah, I didn't have a friend who.
And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
But I really wanted to emphasize once you understand the rules of the game, that this credit system stops being like this burden that just tells you no every time that you want to try to do something. Suddenly it's this opportunity to say, look, I could put my best foot forward and wear my best suit to this in this credit world and put it up there so everybody can see it. So when I want something, they can look at that and be like, oh my God, this guy has stellar credit, which is what I've been able to do. There's a lot more stuff more than just, credit cards and utilizing somebody else's credit card history. But in the small amount of time that I've been able to put my credit together, a lot of times I'll call up and I'll ask for, oh yeah, this is worth saying. Did you guys know that you could negotiate your interest rate down on your credit cards? I bet Nima knew that. But
yeah, I've never done it, but I heard about it.
Yeah, I try to do it at least every 6 months. Is just call them up and be like, hey, lower my interest rate. And more often than not, you get it. At the same time, I also try to bump up my limit. More often than not, I get it. And sometimes I did this once as well, is I converted a non-points card to a points card. So you start getting 1% or 2% back or something from your purchases. It's really worth calling up and getting it, because on that one card, the $23,000 one, I started off at like 14%. I just called them a few months ago, and they lowered it to 8%. And I was like, shit, that's almost like a slightly expensive mortgage. That's so cheap for a credit card. I've heard, I haven't been successful with this one yet, are some people who are able to continually revolve the 0% offers. So, a lot of these credit cards come out with 0% interest for like the first 12 or 15 or 18 months, where once it gets close to that, they essentially call up and they say, hey, I want 0% for another 12 months. And if they say no, they go, okay, well, I'll just switch to another credit card, and they freak out and give them the 0% again. I haven't had... What's that?
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that, yeah.
Chase didn't do it for me, though. And Bank of America didn't do it for me either. So if anyone has had luck with those two, let me know. But I haven't. Going from credit, I wanted to talk a little bit about finance and mortgages. And I want to say mortgages are bullshit. Mortgages are really, really bullshit, and particularly the way that we've been taught to use them. Again, I was thinking about what my coworker said about getting the house and having to pay for 30 years, and that's just what you're going to have to do if you want to move into a house. And that's actually not true if you understand the math behind a mortgage, which is what I didn't understand, despite the fact that I was in advanced math classes in high school, specifically learning about interest, staring at my car payment going, I don't understand how this interest works. And what the unfortunate thing is, and I understand this is a really round number, and this is probably pretty hard to compute, is that interest is typically the second biggest expense that Americans pay in their lives. The first, of course, being taxes. And it mostly has to do with the fact that people refinance their houses. Now, I've made a video about this on my channel called Mortgages Are Bullshit. But what people do when they refinance their house, and they get tricked into it, because, what does your mortgage broker or your banker or whatever say when they try to refinance your house, is they say, oh, I can lower your interest rate, or, oh, I can lower your monthly payment. Well, due to the way mortgages are amortized, I'm sure everyone's heard that term. Amortization, what it means is you're creating a point when the loan is going to end. So there's a starting point and an ending point, and a distinct amount of money that's going to get paid every period, usually per month, from the beginning point to the ending point, and at the ending point, it's done, and you've paid off the whole thing. Well, the way that it's set up, and this is why I couldn't understand my car bill, is that the interest is calculated based on the entire amount that you owe. So let's say you had $100,000 that you borrowed at 12% interest, which would mean your interest every month, or at least for the first month, would be $1,000. You got to see why that makes sense, because 12% on $100,000 would be $12,000, and if you divide that by 12 months in a year, you get $10,000 a month, or excuse me, $1,000 a month. So there's actually an amortization equation, which it's way more complicated than the interest equation, that depending on what the terms of your loan are, they spit out a certain payment during the month. So let's say the terms of my loan spit out that said, okay, I'm going to have a $1,200 payment every month based on this mortgage, this $100,000 mortgage. What that means is the interest gets calculated, which was $1,000, and then they say, okay, well, you owe us $1,200, and of that $1,200, you pay $1,000 interest, and the leftover is principal. So the leftover is $200. So out of the $1,200 you pay, $1,000 goes to interest and $200 goes to principal. And then the next month rolls around, and now you owe $99,800, and then you calculate how much money you owe off of that, which is, it's going to be a little bit less, $1 or $2 or something like that. And very, very slowly, and we've all seen this in our loan payments, the money moves, the payment moves less from interest and more toward principal. And this is called the loan being front-end loaded, which is obviously the bank wants to get their interest money up front before you're able to save up like I did on my car. It came up with my tax return and I paid it off. Well, I'd already paid all the interest. The interest is up front. What happens when you refinance is you start that clock over. And most Americans refinance, I believe it's 5 to 7 years into their mortgage. And if you look at an amortization graph, and you could, if you search for amortization calculator online or on your phone, you could find one and download it, and you put everything in, and it'll do all the math for you and show this to you. If you have a 30-year mortgage, your flipping point from your payment being more principal than interest, so you make your $1,200 payment and you have $600 or more actually going toward principal instead of interest, is 19 years into the loan. 19 fucking years. So most people refi 5 to 7 years into their mortgage, and they start the clock over, which means that 5 to 7 years when almost 80% of their money, when you play with a mortgage calculator, you see it's roughly 80%. 80% of your money goes to interest. You start that clock over, and you go 5 to 7 years, where 80% of your money goes to interest, and you refinance and you start the clock over, and for 5 more years, 80% of your money goes to interest. What you're actually doing is you're turning that 30-year loan into a 35-year loan, a 40-year loan, a 45-year loan, a 50-year loan, and by the time you retire, you have to do a reverse mortgage because there's barely any equity left in your house, because you've refied it all your life, and you die and you leave your kids with this house that's got a mortgage and a second mortgage and a reverse mortgage on it, and there's nothing left to inherit. And the trick is that it's less important what your interest rate is on mortgages, and any loan in particular. But mortgages are the worst because of the length of time in the loan. The length of time in the loan is really what puts the bite into your interest rate. Like if you got a car loan for 5 years, as long as you don't hit some crazy interest rate like 30%, which I'm sure poor people who don't understand this get hit with regularly. But if you got a car loan that's 5 years, the difference between like a 5% and a 10% interest rate really isn't that much. But if you got a 30-year loan, particularly on, not a $30,000 car, but a $300,000 house, if you have a 5.3% interest rate and you have a 30-year loan and you make every payment throughout the life of the loan, you will pay equal amounts principal and interest, which is... So if you had that $300,000 house, you would have paid $300,000 toward principal and $300,000 towards interest. So you literally paid for the house twice. That's with the 5.3% interest rate. Historically speaking, that is an incredibly low interest rate. We've had times in the nation's history where we've actually pushed like 20% interest rates in the 80s. Which I can't even comprehend how much money you'd pay on a 30-year loan on a $300,000 house for a 20% interest rate. But what's less important than the interest rate is where you are in the length of the loan. Because if you're able to get toward the middle of the loan, or like I said, even hit that 19-year mark where you're actually paying more toward principal than you are toward interest in your payments, you're saving way more money than you ever could by refinancing and dropping your interest rate a point, or dropping your monthly payment by $100. Because think about it. If you've if you go to your mortgage broker and your mortgage broker's like, hey, if you refinance, I'll save you $100 a month on your house, and you've paid $50,000 in interest in the last 4 years, and probably roughly $20,000 in principal, or I think even less. If you've paid $50,000 in interest and you start that clock over in order to save $100 a month, how many $100 a months do you need to save to make that $50,000 back? Waiting for Nima to do the math. Just joking. It's a lot. And you can see where this kind of refinancing yourself into oblivion, like I call it, it's really, really shooting yourself in the foot. And there's actually a way, I don't have time to do it in this podcast, and I might get in trouble from the guys who taught me in the classes. I might be breaking some sort of rule by teaching the full thing. But there's actually a way where you can utilize a revolving line of credit, like a credit card. But typically you would use a line of credit because you could pull cash in and out of a line of credit much easier than you can do with a credit card. A credit card is typically going to charge you fees. That you can use the revolving nature of a line of credit to directly attack the principal in a loan, particularly a big loan like a mortgage, where you can skip a large amount of the interest up front using the existing cash flow that you already have. And it's so bizarre that it works out this way, that the high interest of a revolving line or the high interest of a credit card, it's 13% is low sometimes on a credit card. I mean, a lot of these things are like 20, 25, 30%. That I'll stick with 18. That an 18% interest rate on a credit card can actually be quite a bit lower than a 6% interest rate on a mortgage. And it has to do with the fact of this timing within the mortgage, where if your payments are going toward 80% interest and 20% principal, even if you were to take a $10,000 chunk out of a 18% line of credit, pay off a $10,000 chunk on your mortgage, which would skip, obviously it depends on the situation, but it could skip $40,000, $60,000 on a mortgage of the interest. The amount of interest that you're paying on that $10,000 on an 18% card, it's pennies. You count it in hundreds instead of tens of thousands. And the reason is, it all has to do with the front end loaded nature of the mortgage. So, and again, all this depends on everybody's personal situation, the income that you're making, your interest rate, the credit lines you have access to, how big your mortgage is, and blah, 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 everything. But if you understand how this thing works, you can actually attack a mortgage, a 30-year mortgage, and get it paid off in like a third or even a quarter of the time. And it has to do with the fact that you're sending as much income as you possibly can at that principal. And I mean, yeah, it's not getting sent into your savings account. However, if you look at the long term, if you look over 30 years and say, okay, over 30 years, I spent $600,000 on a house because I paid for the $300,000 of principal and $300,000 of interest, versus, okay, in 10 years, I spent $400,000 on a house because I still had to pay some interest within that 10 years. And then for the 20 years after that, I got to put all the money in my savings account and I own my house outright. That's some radically different long-term planning, particularly because I was just simply comparing to paying off a 30-year mortgage and not refinancing it into oblivion. I get chills sometimes when I think of the 2008 mortgage crisis, or housing crisis, because for my group I was doing this in quotes mortgages are bullshit presentation. in Seattle. And it was almost every week I'd get somebody who came up to me who said, if I knew what you had just showed me in 2008, I wouldn't have lost my house. And I get chills thinking that we've all been given these financial tools, mortgages and credit cards and lines of credit and all this sort of stuff. And the only thing that we've been taught to do with them is shoot ourselves in the foot. When if you use them correctly, if you use them like, in quotes, rich people use them, these are wonderfully amazing tools to really change the way that, or I should say, really change your living standard and what you're able to do with your time. Because, I mean, think about that. Imagine my coworker and me wide-eyed in the headlights listening to her tell me about this 30-year mortgage that I couldn't comprehend because I was 21. Imagine how different my attitude would have been if it was like, oh, I'll get it paid off in 10 years. Or even, you know, talking to our kids in high school of, look, instead of being a slave to your house for 30 years, you can get it paid off in 10 years. You can move on to something else. You can grow into bigger projects or whatever. Imagine an entire nation that understood that. And from what I understand, countries like New Zealand, Australia, and I think even South Africa, they understand how this works. And maybe they even do it in Europe. I don't know. Nima, I guess you moved over here before, like you said, everybody was consumed in the horrible fire of consumer debt.
Right.
Of your
I've talked to some of my friends. I've talked to some of my friends in Europe, but they are all saying that there are very strict legal guidelines on how much you can take out of the principal, and even if you wanted to, you couldn't go past 5% a year or something like that. So there's that.
I've heard of that. Used to be the case here, but from what I understand, it's really not anymore.
Yeah, yeah.
In the U.S., I've heard of people who've said, yeah, I had a mortgage once upon a time where there was prepayment penalties and I was only allowed to pay a certain amount of the principal off, but not anymore. I guess people are doing this thing left and right as they figure it out.
Yeah. But it's a really cool idea. I really like the idea, actually, of you use a revolving type loan where you have a certain balance based on how much you took out, and you pay certain interest on that based on your balance, and then you use that to take some chunks out of your mortgage. It's so counterintuitive because the mortgage interest sounds so much lower. But because of the way, like you said, because of the way the mortgage is structured, it's so front-loaded that the majority of your payments you're making in the beginning are only interest payments, and you're only taking very little out of the principal. So you can use a revolving line of credit to help you take more out of the principal and be done with your debt much sooner than if you don't do that, or if you even keep refinancing, then it just gets worse and worse. It's definitely something that everyone should think about. But when you say mortgages are bullshit, you're saying, well, you can still take on a mortgage, but you just handle it more intelligently.
Yeah, I'm being hyperbolic when I say mortgages are bullshit.
Yeah,
they're just a tool. They're not good or bad. They're just a tool. And what's bullshit is the way we've been taught to use the tool. We've been taught to shoot ourselves in the foot with it. Americans have, anyway.
Yeah.
And obviously, as we've talked about here, talking a little bit about the 2008 financial crash, that is primarily or fundamentally due to the dip in the private sector net savings on the aggregate. But in terms of the individual, like this is you and me and Nima looking at our personal world and what's going on. If you understand how to use these tools better, you're better prepared to defend yourself in the case that something, the crash happens. Like I said, I just get chills thinking if everybody was familiar with the concepts of, how to properly handle a revolving credit line and a mortgage and how to balance them between each other, how many people would have been able to stay in their houses during 2008?
Yeah, it would totally screw with the neoliberal agenda for sure.
It would definitely do that. And speaking of the neoliberal agenda, you want to talk some taxes, Nima?
Well,
our favorite thing.
I'm not a tax expert, but sure.
I am also not a tax expert. Disclaimers, asterisk, exclamation mark everywhere. Don't take anything that I'm saying to the bank. Although I actually can refer you to a tax expert. He's got a podcast. Before we even talk about this, Mark J. Kohler podcast. He is a tax attorney and CPA. He is awesome. Everything that I've learned from him. He's the guy who teaches our classes, and I have never, ever thought it was possible to see this guy take taxes and essentially turn it into a comedy show, and get you excited about it. Totally blew my mind. I don't know how anyone can get as excited about it as he does, but he actually manages to take the topic and make it fun and interesting, which I'll do my damnedest right now. But Nima, are you familiar with S corporations?
Yeah, S corporation is basically like a C corporation, except that the entire profit is passed through to one owner, and there's no double taxation as there is in the C corporation.
Mostly accurate. Yes. So I forgot. Do you have a C corporation, Nima?
I don't. I did at one point, but currently I don't. Yeah.
So when you had your C corporation, did you zero it out, or were you actually making money in it? Tell me if I'm getting too private. I just wanted to poke you and see how you paid your taxes for that C corporation.
It was two separate tax returns. One would be for the corporate earnings, and then one for the individual earnings. So yeah.
And then you were an employee for your corporation, right?
Yes.
So when it comes to taxes, and I'm talking about federal taxes here, the states have their own way of screwing with you. The big ones that we're looking from the federal government, as we all know, are income tax and FICA taxes, which are also known as self-employment taxes if you own your own business, which theoretically pay for our neoliberal agenda of Social Security and Medicare, which as MMTers we understand they don't pay for a goddamn thing, and they could be thrown out the window and nothing would really happen other than we'd all have a lot more money. But until that happens, until we can educate enough people that can either vote in or convince their representatives to nix this crap, we got to pay it. So when you get your paycheck from an employer, they take some of your income taxes out and they take out that Social Security Medicare stuff, which is the FICA. And that FICA, it's I always forget the exact percentage. It's roughly 7.65% comes out of your paycheck, and actually the employer pays another 7.65% on their side. So the total, I think, if I remember correctly, is 15.3% that you pay on your income, on top of whatever your income tax rate is. So this is kind of, I think it's even more brutal than income tax, in the sense that there's really no sliding rate or anything on it. You just get smashed with it. It's 15%, done. Then you pay your 12% or 18% or 25% or whatever on your income tax. And what happens when you become self-employed is that because no one's writing you a paycheck anymore, you're required to figure out how much profit that you made, and you've got to pay this 15.3% on whatever you netted yourself. And this is one of the reasons that a lot of people start a business and they fail miserably, is they don't remember to save this 15% in a savings account. At the end of the year, they get slapped upside the head with the self-employment tax. And like, where the fuck did this come from? It hurts. So when you compare this to a corporation, so you become employed, or excuse me, you become self-employed, which allows you to start writing stuff off and you're generating your own income. If you just pay yourself that income as a sole proprietor, like I said, you get hit with this 15.3% tax on top of your income tax. As an S corporation, or I should say as a corporation, you're allowed to split the income that the corporation has earned onto you, both as an employee of that corporation and as essentially a stockholder. You get dividends, more or less, for lack of a better term, from this corporation. And as a C corporation, there's corporate taxes that you have to pay on the dividends. Now, I guess due to the tax cuts, what did it go from, like 35% to 21%? Do you remember what the numbers were, Nima?
Something like that, yeah. At the top rate.
So the story has changed a little bit since I've learned this, but it was initially that the corporate taxes were pretty comparable to the income taxes that you simply would have paid had you simply paid yourself as a sole proprietor. But the S corporation is very interesting in that you still have the same salary dividend split, where you pay some of yourself as an employee and some of yourself as a stockholder. But the stockholder side of it has no self-employment and has no corporate tax. As you were saying, this is that pass-through. So, I'm sure a neoliberal would refer to this as a loophole in the tax code. But the reality of it is that there's a huge S corporation lobby that's there to make sure that this stays available for small business owners to not have all their money gutted out of them sideways in self-employment tax. And this is where things get really funny, is that in the IRS code, the IRS thought ahead and said of the idea that someone might say, okay, well, why don't I just get this corporation, pay myself $0 as an employee and pay 100% as dividends, and then I pay 0% self-employment tax. Well, the IRS thought of that. And the IRS has said
applied income, right?
You have to pay yourself a reasonable salary.
Yeah.
That's what the IRS tax code says. And the natural response to that is, well, what's reasonable?
There's classifications that the IRS has for that.
Actually, I think there isn't. And the way that Mark Kohler, this is a story that he tells, has figured out what is and what isn't reasonable, is he's tracked court cases of who wins and loses in court on this question. And he's actually created a graph of, depending on how much income that you earn, of where this, how much you could put in dividends and how little that you could put in wages and still be safe according to the IRS. It comes out to roughly 1/3, 2/3. So you could do roughly 1/3 in your pay yourself wages, which you have to pay self-employment tax on, and roughly 2/3 dividends, which you don't have to pay the government self-employment tax for, and still be safe with the IRS. And this is backed up through case law of who's been winning and losing in the past. So, of course, the government has it set up where they say, okay, here's this vague term that you have to follow. And the way that you're going to have to figure out that vague term is by looking at the casualties who've tried to figure out that vague term in the past. And the rule of thumb that the last I've heard from Mark Kohler, and this is getting updated all the time because the tax code's constantly flying all around, and the IRS is making new shit up, and Congress is making new shit up and fighting with each other over it, is that in your own business, when you're roughly earning $30,000 a year net, so after all your write-offs, you're coming home with $30,000 a year, the amount of money that you're going to pay to set up and maintain your S-Corp and give yourself payroll and all that crap is going to be less than the amount of money that you're going to have to spend on the self-employment tax had you been a sole proprietor. $30,000 is roughly that line. And I mentioned earlier when I was talking about interest that interest is the second biggest expense that we typically have in our lives. Taxes are number one. Now, personally, I think at the end of the day, we probably spend about 90% of our money on taxes. After we have the income tax and sales tax and property tax and wage taxes and gas taxes and all the fees that you get when you go in to get your driver's license and all that crap. Death taxes and taxes. Personally, I think it's somewhere around 90% that you're paying on taxes. But specifically, if you look at the self-employment tax, if you understand the tax code, which who wants to do that? If you understand the tax code, you can actually save, approximately speaking, 2/3 on self-employment tax. If you're self-employed, this doesn't apply to an employee, which is
so this 15% self-employment tax applies on top of all your other taxes, or how does that work?
Yes. So there's your income tax, which has the brackets, right?
Yeah.
So you get your initial write-off, and then it's like 12%, and then 18%, and I forgot what they are. On top of whatever that is, there's another 15%, which is self-employment tax.
Damn, so I've been paying that without even knowing.
Yeah. It sucks. And when I say it has no mercy, I think my accountant told me when you're in business with yourself, if you're self-employed, the initial write-off of the initial deduction of self-employment tax is $400. As soon as you made $400, you're paying self-employment tax. That 15% kicks in immediately. Bam. So you can negate 2/3 of your self-employment tax by understanding the tax code and utilizing this S corporation properly, and which is frustrating. So I've been talking about this where I guess I want people to be able to listen to this, and I'm not giving enough information in this podcast to actually go out and do this yourself, but I am giving you enough information to go out and learn more about it, exposing you to the idea so you can eventually figure it out for yourself. When I learned about all this, my first response was anger. I told you that Mark Kohler gets all excited and he looks like, look at all the opportunity and you don't have to pay all these taxes. My first response was anger, because we often hear, particularly from libertarians and anarchists, talk about crapitalism. And crapitalism is where you have capitalism, but you have the government intervene on behalf of larger corporations to change the laws to make it difficult for the lower for the smaller people to get started and compete with them. So we have a system which, ironically, and this is the schizophrenic America that I was talking about. Ironically, the rules are the same for everybody. The tax code applies to everybody from Donald Trump to some welfare bum. However, we don't receive the same education about how the rules work. So if we've got 35 bazillion pages of tax code, and it's not a matter of whether you read it, it's a matter of whether you find someone who's read it and is able to translate it to you like I am right now, or Mark Kohler has done for me. If you don't have that available to you, you're fucked. And if you're an employee, this is the thing that really pisses me off. If you're an employee, particularly if you're someone who works with your muscles and with your back, like you're a mason, or you're a framer, or you make foundations or something that's like really hard, and you start your own business, or excuse me, let's say you're working for somebody else. You're taking home like $80,000 a year, which, it's not that bad, but you just get pummeled with taxes, particularly, if you're putting in overtime or something, you just get pummeled with these taxes. And the more ass you bust, like in the most literal sense, the more physical labor that you do to earn this money with your blood, sweat, and tears, the more it just gets gutted right out of you. Whereas if you understand, okay, if I get my own business and I start learning these rules, and I get the S corporations and the write-offs and all the, all this sort of stuff, and we didn't talk about retirement accounts or health savings accounts or whole life insurance policies or all this, there's all this crazy stuff where you can start utilizing the money in a way that you really don't pay nearly the amount of taxes as you would if you had put the time and blood and sweat and tears into it to earn that money. Where if we're going to talk about class warfare, the class that chooses to work hard is the one that gets punished more according to the tax code. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs and I shouldn't say entrepreneurs, a lot of gurus who teach entrepreneur systems come out and say, oh, look, this is the government saying that they want you to make a lot of money. This is why they give you this preferential treatment if you're a business owner and you use the tax code properly. That is such bullshit. I mean, I gotta say, that is such bullshit. This is obviously set up in a way, it's the capitalist way of making sure that, like Nima was saying before, that the big corporations, the big players, have the rules set up to favor them and not the little guy. And they've done it in this like exquisitely diabolical method where they can come out and say, look, the rules are the same for everybody. What's your problem? While at the same time, they control the educational system that doesn't teach you any of these rules. I never remember learning about credit in school or even college. I never remember learned anything about finance or how to handle a mortgage or anything about how to... Not even how... Like, it's not that they didn't teach me how to properly navigate the tax code. They didn't even teach me how to, like, fill out a tax return. This thing that it's like, if you don't fill this out the right way, the government can come take your property and audit you and, put liens on your house and all sorts of other crap.
One could almost think the public school system wasn't designed to educate us.
That's an interesting segue. Nima, as a listener of Peace Revolution podcasts, do you have a fiery rant ready about the Prussian educational system?
Well, if we weren't almost 2 hours into it, but maybe a short...
Give us the fast-forward version.
Well, so from that podcast I've learned, and also School Sucks podcast, is that the centralized schooling system as we observe it today in almost all countries, Western countries for sure, which is basically the public schooling system was originally invented by the Prussians, because the Prussians were very concerned that their soldiers would run away from hordes of hostile French soldiers whom they were supposed to battle in the Franco-Prussian War. Or in one of those wars, at least, where the Germans...
No, Napoleonic Wars. You got to go back another 70 years. We're talking about early 1800s here.
Yeah. So they came up with a system that would turn people into obedient foot soldiers, where people would not, be willing to die for glory and country, and not think for themselves, and say yes, ma'am, and only speak when they're supposed to, etc. So that system first was launched in Prussia and was arguably the precursor to a lot of other things that ensued later on in Germany, like Nazi Germany, etc. A very militaristic society through World War I, World War II. And
the emphasis on obedience.
Obedience, yeah.
Right.
And
you do what we say. We want you smart enough to understand what I'm telling you to do, but not smart enough to question that I've told you to do it. And
the U.S. actually, from its inception, had a very decentralized schooling system, from what I understand. Very basic things were taught in a red little house in your town. And then a lot of kids were being homeschooled. A lot of kids were in private or independent schools. And so in the 1800s, there was a delegation, I believe it was for the state of Massachusetts. And I believe
Horace
Mann, John Dewey, and folks like that, who traveled over to Russia and were just absolutely excited about Prussia, sorry, oh my God. And we're just excited of how obedient people were turned through the system, and figured we could use that in the U.S., but instead of using it for a totalitarian system, we'll use it for Republican means, is what they said. By that, they just meant their own Republican, not Republican Party system, but their system of having a republic. And so they thought they could use that system for good, and so they instituted it, and it's become more and more centralized over the years, to where now, as we all know, we have prison companies building schools, and we have a curriculum that is designed to keep people dumb or make them dumber, to discourage,
emphasize the obedience.
Yeah, discourage any curiosity, thinking outside the box. Most of your answers are multiple choice. So through the Prussian school system since then has been implemented all over the world, including, I believe, in Japan even, where the entire...
Japan ate it up.
Yeah, they basically copied the Prussian constitution when they made their new constitution, I believe. And
during the Meiji Restoration. Exactly.
Yeah. So that's...
and I think it's... Go ahead.
Yeah, so that school system was not designed to educate or teach us. It was designed to instill behaviors, to program us, and to make us predictable, so that we can be more easily managed by those who wish to do that to us.
I want to emphasize as well that it's even the university system. We get a PhD. Nima, native German speaker, what does PhD stand for?
Actually, is it philosophy doctor or something?
German. No, it's German something.
Yeah,
it's a long word. I always forget it.
In German, we don't even say PhD. In Germany, it's doctor. So it's actually only used in the US, I believe, to say PhD.
Oh.
So
well, it stands for something German. Go look it up on Wikipedia, whoever everybody's listening. But the PhD system actually comes from Prussia.
Yeah.
And it used to be that the only place in the world that you could get a PhD was in Prussia. And that Horace Mann, this guy that Nima was referring to earlier, was the first American to get a PhD in Prussia, and he happened to be the guy who brought the public educational system over to here. And the fact that PhD is just something assumed that you get after you've gone to college for 8 years and that you don't get something else is a pretty fucking spectacular glory.
PhD stands for Doctor of Philosophy.
Hold on a second. I'm going to look it up. PhD. Am I making shit up?
Doctor of Philosophy. No, but the system, it's true that the system is Prussian. The PhD in the US is basically just a doctor in Germany.
Doctor of Philosophy. Okay, well, in any case, the fact that PhD is something that you just assume that you're going to get at a university after you've been there for 8 years is testament to the fact that the German or the Prussian educational system has taken over the world. Like Nima mentioned, the educational system that we have is the way that the Prussians put it out, and then of course the universities were supposed to be for the people who would be the managers.
Yeah, the elite,
right? So Nima talked about these lower classes. We need to be trained them to be controllable and to be obedient, not to question. Well, then you, of course, you'd have to train the people who are going to tell those people what to do, and that's what the universities were supposed to be for. Well, I think at this point, university now has simply become an extension of the public educational system of keeping you stupid and obedient.
Well, it's also become an extension of the intelligence community.
What do you mean?
Well, in that the CIA and the NSA and other intelligence agencies utilize university research programs to discover new technologies or to experiment on people and indoctrinate people, fund radical groups, and there's been tons of articles, maybe I think about a year ago or so, about how China has actually infiltrated a lot of the U.S. college system, and there was mainstream articles about that. So the university system is, just another arm of the New World Order's indoctrination system, if you will.
Which is antithetical to everything that I've been talking about so far in this podcast, or this specific recording. What the rules are, and I want to bring back that caveman story when I was mentioning, kind of the origins of money and the origins of credit. I know we talk about a lot that, the state historically has been required to create money, but that credit itself is simply kind of a measurement of relationships between people that is a natural phenomenon of that relationship. And it takes 12 years of school to beat that out of us, that we could actually use this credit between ourselves, and that we can, if we understand that the credit and by extension the money is a tool that we could use to I guess do whatever we want in our lives, but I guess more specifically, get a house, get a car, raise a family, start a business, do all these other things that we've been ingrained to think that the way you earn money is by the sweat of your brow and the pain in your back. Where in reality, we could really, if we could learn to step back and use the money as a tool, and a tool to get our time back, even the tax code is set up to benefit you that way. And of course, it's done through this complex nastiness of lobbyists and legislation and all that stuff to reward the people who aren't working per hour and punish the people who are working per hour, obviously to support the people who aren't. But due to the schizophrenic nature of the country, there's nothing stopping you, the person who's working per hour, from becoming, from flipping to the other side, as opposed to most of history where, it was a matter of law. I mean, not that the knowledge would have been available to you anyway to be able to do this, but it was a matter of law that, there's a caste system here, and I'm the lord, you're the serf, and that's the end of it. I'll enforce it. So I hope this podcast, if these ideas are new to you, can kind of serve as a, I don't know, maybe a door opening for you to get a little more power, a little bit more control over your life. You know, we always say in the opening, we want to make you more powerful politically, philosophically, and professionally. You know, this is kind of the professional aspect.
Financially.
And financially, yes. Because I get a lot of comments. I know there's some leftists, in quotes, who like to listen to this. That I think, you know, they probably pick them up from the real progressives who are pro MMT guys, and they come and listen to us because we're talking MMT. And I hear a lot of this talk of, you know, essentially class warfare. Of, you know, there's downtrodden and there's these people on the bottom that can't get their stuff together due to the economic and political conditions. And there's a large truth to that. As we've discussed, you know, the private sector has to have a certain amount of net savings provided by the government in order to do anything. But that's not the whole story. There's the other side of the story is you're responsible for getting your own shit together and learning the rules and understanding the game. And these are some of the rules to the game that you've never learned, largely because the public school system is there to make sure that you don't learn it. But that's just kind of the public school system is just kind of a modern iteration of the previous systems, which were, I guess, you know, the real class warfare of legally instituted caste separations. But to have this information available and to have this information at our fingertips, particularly in the age of the internet, I think is equally as important as understanding our political system and making sure that, you know, the government is providing enough savings for the private sector to actually be a private sector. Nima, do you have any commentary on that?
Well, yeah, it's good. I mean, that's an important point that without public spending, we can't have a private sector, or we can't have private sector net saving. With that, a robust, strong private sector. So, in a system where the government taxes, we need public spending to provide for those savings. Yeah.
And like I was saying, on the flip side, even if we you know, we need a certain amount of or a certain structure of our government to provide what you just said, as an individual listening to this, you are still responsible for understanding the rules of the game and using the rules of the game to, you know, do whatever you need to do. You know, at least in the basics, get your survival needs met. Which seems to be some of what the left largely rails about. Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about it. And unless you do, Nima, I'm going to say this was Amagi, episode 7. And thanks for listening, and we'll hope to see you next time. Thanks again, Nima.
Thank you.